Hi, my name is Ryan Langwish and this is Ludo Lodge. If you're new to the channel, it's all about providing content to help spark growth for game designers. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, consider subscribing for future content. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 board games that inspired me as a designer in 2019. Now, for a game to be eligible for this list, I needed to have played it for the first time in 2019. So last year I played 26 new to me games, which is actually a little bit fewer than a typical year for me. But enough that the top 5 is still kind of the cream of the crop for me to be going through in this list. Now, another thing to consider here is this isn't me just saying my 5 favorite games that I played last year. As a game designer, when I'm playing board games, there's kind of like 2 different experiences I'm having. I'm having me as a gamer just enjoying the experience and enjoying board games, and I love playing board games. But then there's me, the designer, that I can't shut off while I'm playing, that's looking at it from the perspective of designing games and what the designer did and how different mechanisms are working to provide the desired experience. And so for this list, I'm really leaning into that second part of my experience with board games. And so these are going to be the games that I just found myself admiring from the perspective of a board game designer and appreciating what the designers did or brought to the table with the experience that they created. And really just the games that brought me joy when it comes to the art of board game design. There's just so much that can be done in the medium of board game design, and I'm constantly playing games that surprise me and make me smile at ways that they figure out ways to provide new experiences than what I've seen before. So before I get into the top 5, I'm actually going to do a real quick honorable mention list of 3 games that just missed the cut, and I'm going to force myself to be brief talking about them, but I thought that they were worth mentioning here. So the first of which is Decrypto. So Decrypto is a word game similar to maybe Codenames or some other games we've seen come out that rely on giving clues to try to help your team guess words, but there's certain constraints on how you can give clues. The clever thing in Decrypto is how it pits 2 teams against each other in such a way that your clues that you're giving need to be good enough for your team to be able to identify them correctly, but obscure enough that your opponents aren't able to ultimately figure out what the word is. And it's a little hard to explain without getting into exactly how the game works, but I just really appreciated kind of the new experience it brought to the table. It has mechanisms that I've seen in a lot of games, you know, a little bit of Codenames. There's a little bit of like Dixit in the I want to give a good clue but not too good of a clue, and we've seen that in some other party games. But I really feel like the way that Decrypto combines them is very clever and provides an experience that I really appreciated and really have had fun with, and I'm looking forward to getting to play this one more. So that is one of my honorable mentions. Honorable mention number 2, it's a little bigger here, is The Gallerist by Vital Lacerda. This is the first game I've had the opportunity to play by Lacerda, and I'd been wanting to for a long time because I'd heard so much about kind of just his ability to create these really complex systems in kind of heavy strategy games, and they tend to be very well received and very highly rated. And I'm really glad I got the opportunity to try this one. And I think what I appreciate the most about it is just, and kind of I think it's kind of his trademark style, is how he takes a very complex system and he represents it in the game, and he lets that complexity stay in the game and kind of all the systems, but the inputs that the players have to interact with those systems are fairly simplistic. In The Gallerist, it's essentially a worker placement game where there's only 4 spots to go. And you can't go where you currently are. You're always moving to another spot. So on your turn, you really have 3 different spots, each of which kind of has 2 routes that you can go in resolving it. But in terms of worker placement games, that's kind of on the low end of options. Yet each of those options sets off these ripple effects of, I go and I discover a new artist as my action. Well, now that artist has its own reputation that's going up that affects the value of that artist's work in the market, and that affects maybe what I need for the international market, and also, what I'm building up in my own gallery. And it's just all these interconnected systems, not to mention the central board where there's actually patrons walking around that you're trying to go into your gallery to be able to reap the benefits of these collectors and investors and things. And I more than any other game I've played or designer I've seen, I just appreciate the way that he's able to keep the complexity of a system while not offloading that complexity on the player. Now, the Gallerist, it's still a complex game. It's not a game I'm going to play with anybody, and teaching the game isn't, the shortest thing. But it's still, when it boils down to it, is fairly simple what you can do in the game, and it's more kind of the complexity of the inner working systems and how you affect those that makes the game really interesting. So that is why the Gallerist is one of my honorable mentions. Now, I have quite a few of the games here that I'm going to be talking about, but this last honorable mention I don't actually have, and that is Horrified, which is a cooperative game where the players are trying to fight against the Universal Studios classic monsters such as Dracula or the creature from the Black Lagoon. And it's a very standard cooperative game. If we think of kind of like family level co-ops like Pandemic, as kind of the poster child of that genre, Horrified, in a lot of ways, isn't anything special, but yet when I played it, I was just struck by how elegant of a design it was and how well it brought together a lot of kind of maybe best practices in these kinds of games, combined it with a really good theme, and just the end result is something that now I personally would probably recommend as my top entry level co-op for someone who's looking for a family level co-op, even probably before recommending Pandemic. And I think one of the things that I experienced that really struck me more than anything was when I went to learn this game, I read the rulebook, which is nice and short and really, really well laid out, and I read the rules, and then it was the day before I was going to be teaching the game, and that when I went to teach the game the next day, I did not even look at the rulebook once. I cannot think of, any other game I've played where I haven't had to reference the rulebook my first time teaching it. But all the rules were so intuitive and just so baked into, there were lots of good reminders of iconography on the boards, all really good. And so just the elegance that with one read-through, I'm able to teach the game effectively and play it without ever needing to check any rule exceptions, and that simple of a rule set is able to provide such a rich experience with the co-op, I'm just really impressed by. And I also love how the scalable difficulty works in Horrified. Basically, you can pick how many of these monsters you want to go up against simultaneously. So I think in an easy game, you pick 2 of them. In a normal game is 3. And if you really want to try a hard one, you could try 4 of them at once. And what's really cool about this is a couple things. One, it has, that ability to tune the co-op difficulty in a very natural way to what the group's level is and what they want to, have their chances of winning be. But I think the other really cool thing is there's, 6 different monsters, including the base set. And so you're just getting so much variety. If I play with 3 monsters, my set of 3 is always going to be different. And each one of them operates in different ways, how they kind of operate and how you work towards meeting their win condition. And so I just love that, how every game feels different, which I am a total sucker for that. Variable setup and things that make each game feel different is one of my favorite kind of things to get injected into games. And I think Horrified does a great job of that while packaging it in a very accessible family weight co-op that I would highly recommend. And it inspires me towards more elegant designs that can really thrive for that audience. So that's why Horrified is another one of my honorable mentions. And if it sounds like I'm raving, it's because at this point, these top games, I do really, I get excited talking about these mechanisms. But the 5 that I have coming up are ones that I even consider more inspiring or struck me even more than the 3 that I've mentioned so far. So without further ado, let's go to my number 5. Now my number 5 is actually the last game on my list that I don't have a physical copy of. I actually played it with my younger brother, and that is Shoubou. So Shoubou is an abstract game through and through, no theme to be had, where there's these 4 wooden boards, and each one starts with 4 black stones on it and 4 white stones on it on opposite rows of that board. And each board is just a 4x4 grid. The main mechanism in the game is that on your turn, you need to make 2 moves. You have to make a move that's a passive move, and then you have to make a move that's an active move. However, your active move is going to be basically a mirror image of whatever your passive move is. So for example, if I move one of my stones on, this bottom right board for my passive move, and I move it 2 spaces straight. For my active move, I have to move a stone 2 pieces straight, either on the board across the rope or the one next to it. So I'm always going to go to one of the adjacent boards for my active move. But the really fascinating piece of all this is that your passive move cannot push stones. So I cannot run into any other stones or my opponent's stones, but my active move can. And the whole goal of the game is you're trying to push your opponent's stones off of the boards. And so what makes this so interesting is you're trying to think, what passive move can I do that's going to set me up on a different board to do an active move that, might push my opponent off or set me up to push my opponent off. But it isn't just the active move that I care about, because my stone on my passive move, I also want to be setting up to do things in the future and be setting up to not be at risk of being pushed off by my opponent. And I don't play a ton of abstract games, but whenever I do, my favorite abstracts tend to be the ones that I just appreciate the beauty of the design so much that I don't even care if I'm winning or losing. I just am like, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful how this is working. And that is how I felt when I was playing Shoubou. It was just the way it made me think was unlike any game I had played before. Just this kind of thinking of 2 mapped moves together that both go towards my goals, and the fact that the win condition for the game is getting all of your opponent's stones off of just one of the 4 boards. So any of the 4 boards could be the one that you win on, and conversely could be the one you lose on. So when I'm moving that stone as my passive move, I need to be careful and make sure I'm not, losing position on this board. And so this balancing act of the 4 boards and mapping these moves, I loved it. I really want to play it more, but it felt so fresh for an abstract. And especially an abstract that really is pretty pure abstract. I mean, we've seen a lot of kind of these new hybrid abstracts. So things like Azul or Santorini come to mind, or Dragon Castle, where it's kind of abstract at its core, but maybe layers on some variable player powers or maybe some other mechanisms that you wouldn't normally find in abstracts. Shoubou is pretty traditional. It is 1v1. We're moving our pieces on the grid, trying to knock each other off and get to that win condition. And yet it made me think different than any other game I've ever played. And so I have to give it the nod to make the list, and that is why Shoubou is my number 5. And coming in at number 4 is a game that I had on my wish list of wanting to try for a very long time, but never got around to it, and finally this year did, and that is Keyflower. Now, Keyflower is in the series by Richard Breeze, the Key series, because all the titles have key in the name. And Keyflower is by far the most highly rated and kind of a highly acclaimed game in the series. And it is another example of something that felt just very fresh when I was playing it. Despite not being a new game, the mechanisms in Keyflower are really just unlike anything I've really played before. So it revolves around this auction mechanism where every player has meeples of red, yellow, and blue. And there's different tiles that come up that you're going to be auctioning off and bidding on to be able to add to your own personal village. But the thing that makes this auction so fascinating is that there's more happening at once than just the auction. And what I mean by that is you can be bidding meeples to try to, win tiles to bring into your village. But I could also take a meeple and just use a tile. I could use one of the tiles that's being bid on, I could just use the action on it. Or while we're bidding, I could just go use an action in my village. Or I could just go take an action in somebody else's village. And this is all happening at once. It's not like we have the auction phase and then we're going to have the worker placement phase. It's kind of this hybrid phase where you got to kind of be weighing, like, what are my different priorities? Am I, more interested in making sure I can grab these tiles or, triggering some of the abilities in my village to be able to produce resources that I can convert to points. Additionally, there's kind of a turn order thing that you can bid on, just like the other tiles. That's going to determine kind of the draft order for these ships that come through. So it's like, man, I really want ship number 1. The resources on that are what I need. So if I want first pick, I need to pick there. But maybe I don't think other people are going to be interested in that. Like, you don't need the sawmill resource, so maybe I'll risk it and hope that you don't pick that boat. And all this is happening simultaneously, which by itself feels very, very fresh and unique to me. But the piece on top of it that just blows it open for me is how that bidding and the worker placement works, in that only meeples of the same color can go to a particular tile. And so this is interesting from a couple of angles. One is the auction. So if I go and I bid on this tile with red, now if anybody else wants to compete with me for that tile, they have to use red meeples. And that just changes everything, right? Like, I may have more of a certain color than other players, and based on how the game flow works and how meeples come back, oftentimes as the game goes on, you have actually a pretty good idea of, I know, player B over there has a lot of blues, and so I can kind of use that to to determine, like, if I'm going to try to outbid him on something. But it's just very interesting. It's not just like I have currency that I'm bidding. It's kind of in these specific suits, and you have to follow suit when you're bidding on that. Additionally, that determines the color that can be used to activate that tile. So if someone wants to take the action, they have to now use red if I bid with red. And vice versa. If somebody goes first and takes the action, if anybody wants to bid on it, they have to follow suit. And that just... as this unfolds, and again, this is true of pretty much everything on this list, where as I'm playing the game, I'm just sitting there like smiling to myself watching this unfold, because it's just was so interesting how, like, my decisions of what my motivations were for things, and kind of, okay, if I bid on this, like, I don't have many more of that color, or I'm saving that color to do this other thing, so if somebody outbids me there, I'm going to be stuck, because I don't have more of that specific color. But then I also have to consider, well, if somebody bumps me out, I can actually now move my bid to do something else. And so, I can kind of have a contingency plan. And that was actually something I appreciated a lot. I tend to not like bidding games where it's kind of like blind and everybody loses their bids, because it always feels terrible if you lose the bid and you lose all of your what you bid. And so I like here that when you lose a bid, you get to reallocate, and there's kind of this shifting around, and that can really change things. And it just, again, it felt so fresh and just such interesting decisions. Now, is any of it particularly thematic? Not by any stretch. Like, it is very arbitrary, but I think it's a good example of how, going for a very mechanics-heavy approach can sometimes lead you to things that you would never get to if you were really kind of forcing yourself to stick to the theme. And as a result, Keyflower is able to provide an experience that I don't think another game provides. Now, the opposite of that true is that if you lean into theme more, you can get to places that you wouldn't get to if you just focused on mechanics. But I think Keyflower is a good example of that. It's another one I really would like to play more. I'm going to explore more, but I really appreciate it. I'm glad I finally got around to playing it, and that is why Keyflower is my number 4. For my number 3, we're going to be talking about a game that couldn't be more of an opposite of Keyflower in terms of its style and kind of the reasons for why it inspires me as a game designer. And that is going to be War of the Ring. So unlike Keyflower, War of the Ring is a highly, highly thematic experience. It's obviously based on the Lord of the Rings universe, and I was fortunate that going into my first play of this game, I had actually just finished reading through the Lord of the Rings, and so I was in the zone of the lore and just like getting excited about going through kind of this epic experience of kind of reliving the story in your own way each time you play this game. I have to admit though, in War of the Ring, it came out I think in 2005, so this is not a new game. And I definitely had some fears about it for that reason, because one, it came out, I'm going to talk about 2005 like it's old, way back in 2005, but in the board gaming hobby that's been exploding in the last 20 years, we've seen a lot happen since 2005, and a lot of just games building on each other and learning from each other. And so there's a lot of games, even from the early 2000s, that feel dated compared to kind of what's coming out now. And so, I saw War of the Ring, it's back in 2005, it's really highly rated, but it's also such a beloved IP that I just had this feeling of like, is it highly rated because it's that good, or is it highly rated because it was good in 2005 and people love the theme and like, this is the game to get that theme. And I was so pleasantly surprised to find that the design, like forget the theme, like the design of War of the Ring is so solid. And as I'm reading the rulebook and seeing kind of these different mechanisms and how they tie into the theme and the lore of Lord of the Rings, I swear it is just like a masterclass on thematic mechanisms. Like, there are so many great examples of mechanics that the kind of output of those mechanics so fits the model of what should be happening in the theme of it. And there's different ways you can approach thematic games. I mean, a lot of times when people think of like highly thematic games, it's like, oh, a lot of, like the Eldritch Horror approach, for example, or Arkham Horror, where, it's a lot of like, I read these cards and some narrative happens in some story, and that's really thematic because there's story. But I think my favorite thematic interties games is when it's not so much just like this disconnected moment where we're reading through something, but rather a mechanism that just its essence is fits the theme. So I think a great example in War of the Ring is how, Sauron is searching for the ring and needs to try to find the ring. And the player that's playing Sauron at the beginning of the turn is going to be rolling all of his action dice. However, before rolling, he has to allocate any number of those dice to the I side, which basically represents his efforts towards trying to search for the ring. And so I might have, 5 dice, and I'm going to put 2 towards the I. But then, or the hunt is what they call it in the game. But then I have to take those other dice and I have to roll them, which means I could roll I's. And if I roll those I icons, I have to also add those to the hunt. And I find this to be such a beautiful thematic mechanism for kind of Sauron's greed searching for the ring. Because you have to decide, okay, how I need to be putting, searching for it, or I'm gonna allow them to make too much progress with, get under my nose getting through Mordor. But if I put ones in there, I may end up getting more than I wanted. And it's just like that theme of like he can't keep himself from putting too much attention towards the ring, and that comes through in the mechanics and what you feel as the player that's playing that. And it's a beautiful mechanism. I just love it. And that's just one example in this game. I love how the mechanism of the fellowship works, how Frodo and Sam are moving, but it's hidden movement, and only if they get revealed do they have to kind of commit to what path they've taken. And at the beginning of the game, all of the characters in the fellowship start to be considered with moving with the Fellowship, but you have the opportunity to strategically break them off and have them go do other things. Just, very similar to, the book and the movies, but it unfolds in its own way. Like, it doesn't tell the story of the movies. It gives you the building blocks to tell your own story in the same universe. And I've only played it once at this point, and it was a great play. And, it came down to the wire where Frodo's about to throw the ring in and falls to corruption, and all of Middle-earth, falls to the powers of Sauron. But if you are a game designer that has worked with thematic games before, or has a strong interest in developing highly thematic games based on some source material, I think War of the Ring is a must play, just for great examples on how to do that very effectively. And don't let the age fool you. I think it's definitely worth one trying or getting even now. And that's why War of the Ring is my number 3. At number 2, I have a game that kind of flew under my radar for a while until eventually it did win the Kennerspiel and really kind of blew up with its popularity. But I remember when I first saw the review for it, I was kind of like, that seems a little weird, and I didn't really think much of it. And that is the Quacks of Quedlinburg. Now, if you're not familiar with the game, it's very much built around a push your luck mechanism. So the whole game is built around we're making our potions by blindly drawing tokens out of a bag, and the core decision is how far do you go? When do you actually stop? Because if you get too much of a certain, these white tokens that are numbered, if it exceeds I think it exceeds 7, your pot explodes and you lose the progress in what you would have gotten that turn. And I think when I first saw it, it was like, that just seems weird. Like this, you're drawing these from a bag, and it's like, ooh, I got a 3, I go forward 3 spaces. I got a 2, I go forward 2 spaces. And my only decision is like, when do I stop? It didn't seem super compelling. I mean, I had seen push your luck games before. I enjoy playing Can't Stop, and I've enjoyed some other ones, but it's like, okay, what new is this really bringing to the table? And the more I looked into it, and then finally when I had the chance to own it, and I've actually played Quacks of Quedlinburg quite a bit at this point, it really does bring something new to the table, to this genre, and in a very fresh way, and just something very different than other games that I've played. I think one thing that it does really well is it says, okay, well, what's the most kind of fun part in this experience? It's honestly like that, the thrill of drawing a token out and like, oh, I got my really, really good token, or, oh, I didn't get it, that thrill. And it says, okay, I'm going to have you do that like 100 times during the game. Like you are constantly doing that. And so, you're just getting so many opportunities to have those little moments of joy and excitement and just thrill. And so I think it's a good example on like, if you're designing a game and there's something that particularly is fun for the player, like maybe it's worth asking yourself, how could I adjust the design to let them do that more? Or just, and even maybe push it to the extreme and say, like, if I just let them do it like crazy, what would that even look like? And I think it could push you in some interesting directions thinking about a design. And I think it's a lot of what makes Quacks of Quedlinburg work so well, besides the fact that it's simultaneous play. So there's not even much downtime at all for doing this. It's like I get all those thrills of drawing, and then there's some things between round and buying new ingredients, which is fun in and of itself. And then it's back to doing it again. And so it's just like almost zero downtime, almost 100% doing the thing that's most fun. And I think that's just a really good implementation of that. I think another thing I like about it is just how it's constructed to make sure that everybody's still enjoying themselves, kind of regardless of how they're doing. I actually did a Mechanism Spotlight video talking about the catch-up mechanic in Quacks of Quedlinburg, and how basically the further you are behind, the more at the beginning of each round you get to move your token forward and kind of start further ahead, which, while it isn't like the hugest advantage in terms of, I haven't seen a lot of people come back, like if they've been quite a ways behind, it feels so good if you're that person that's getting to move your token way. And I just love how at the beginning of every round, like everybody, regardless of where they are in the game, is happy and like so excited to do it. And I think Quacks of Quedlinburg just leans into these simple joys and just lets you go crazy with them in a way that I haven't seen from a game recently, or at least not to the level that I feel like Quacks of Quedlinburg succeeds with it. And so, yeah, I have loved the accessibility of it, and kind of just it bridges that easy to teach, and kind of the non-gamer crowd can enjoy it, but it has enough meaningful decisions to keep maybe the gamers more invested and intrigued. And I just think it's really well done, and I think it's well deserving of the Kennerspiel. And that's why it is my second most inspiring design that I played in 2019. And while all those games get me fired up about game design and excited about kind of the opportunities and what designers are doing within the medium, there's one game that rose to the top for me, and that would be Tois. Now, Tois is it falls into kind of the same category as Keyflower, in that it's a game that's been on my wanna-play list for a long time. I think it came out back in 2012 or so. And, I mean, you look at this cover, and you figure this might as well be named yet another Euro game. It just looks like the prototypical kind of boring, mechanical Euro game. And I wish I had sooner realized how much more there is to this design than kind of just your normal cube pushing game. So Tois, if you haven't played it before or haven't heard of it, basically each player is a character in the city of Tois that's trying to gain the most victory points and reputation by doing things like battling off threats of the city, helping to build the cathedral, and just other things in the city to build up their influence and their esteem with the townspeople. Which sounds at this point, again, like the most kind of drab, basic Euro game theme that you could have. But I think there's two things that just strike me about Tois. The first is how deceptively thematic this game is. You know, you look at it and you look at the mechanisms, and I could even see people playing it and kind of missing just how thematic the things are. But whenever I found myself doing some of kind of the normal Eurogame cube pushy things, it was like, oh, well, of course, if I fight off these threats, I'm going to get influence with the townspeople, because they're going to see that I'm someone who helps to fight off those threats. And of course, I can kind of influence or get people to help me out, even if they're outside of my district, because I'm more influential and by spending my influence. Like, that makes a lot of sense. And then the whole central mechanism with these dice, that you're gonna roll dice in your district for where you have, your workers have influence. There's kind of three different main sections, and there's the red, the yellow, and the white. The red's like military, and so if I have more people in the military building, I get to roll more red dice because I have more influence with kind of the military side of the city. However, I can use other people's dice. When we're going around, you have the opportunity that you can basically kind of take dice from other people's district by paying them, which again is this thematic thing of like, you pay for maybe you don't have the direct influence, but if you're paying, you can get people to work for you or get access to resources that you wouldn't normally have. And so that whole core mechanism that I'm guessing started as a mechanism, I'm guessing the designers came up with the kind of clever dice thing of you needing to make a group of dice of the same color and you have to pay for ones that aren't your own, ends up, if you kind of look at what's happening in the system, feeling really thematic and looking really thematic. And on top of that, throughout the game, there's these activity cards that come out. In every game, there's kind of 3 different activity cards in each color that are going to get revealed throughout the game. And those are kind of the core variable ways that you're going to be scoring or using certain abilities. And again, if you look through that deck, I just had a smile on my face with how thematic all these things were. I mean, you have archers that you get to go use, and they allow you to fight against the threats using your military influence, but you have to roll, and only on a certain roll do you hit, because, the archers are raining down arrows, but it's not necessarily always going to equate to getting hits. Or there's other ones that let you power up an ability that you can use throughout the game. So there was a tithe one where basically you can spend them to collect money from the other players, which again, each one of these, I can see how the designers had so much fun kind of coming up with thematic concepts and saying, okay, what would the mechanisms look like in this game for that concept? And because they created this system that was very kind of married to the theme. They had a lot of knobs, and buttons to push to make those different things thematic and interesting, and end up being mechanically interesting in that same effort. I think sometimes I, like many others, probably kind of start lumping Euro games into the same category and kind of thinking of them the same in terms of how they approach theme. And Tois really kind of made me reevaluate kind of like, what does it mean to be a highly thematic game? And I feel like more Euro games could learn from games like this on how to embrace theme while still being kind of like a mechanics first design. The second thing that I love about Tois is how it basically does not put a cap on kind of the crazy moves that you get to pull off. So a lot of those activity cards in the game follow some formula of you have to go here with a group of some color of dice, and then you divide the sum of those dice to determine how many times you trigger the card. So maybe this one is yellow dice divided by 4. So if I go there with a yellow group of 12, I would get to execute that card 3 times. Now what I love is there's no limit. Like, they don't say to a max of 3 or to a max of 5. Every one of these cards, like, if you can find a way, you could trigger as many times as you want. And while the groups of dice are limited to just 3, so you might think, okay, like the most you're going to get is 18 if you manage to get 3 6s. There's other cards in the game that let you do some clever things. I mean, there's one that lets you kind of put cubes on it and then later spend those to bump up all the dice in a group by 2. Or there's other ones that let you kind of mix and match dice. And so there's ways that you can bump that total up even more. And my favorite moments playing Tois is when you figure out how to set this up here so that I can do this, so that I can get these dice, so I can throw this, huge pile through this activity card like 7 times and just like get tons of money. I mean, like get just rain down money or rain down victory points or get some other resource. And it just is so liberating that not only the game doesn't put the cap there, but it gives you the tools to be able to really just push it. Whereas, other games of this style, maybe it's like the range of big moves that are possible in the system is kind of capped just by how the system works. And it's what gets me excited about playing. I mean, I love Tois from the perspective of a gamer, but as a game designer, it was my top one of the year in just both the thematic tie-ins for what otherwise looks like a dry game and just the freedom that it affords on top of some very solid mechanisms. And I could get into what I love about the mechanisms, but the freedom it gives to just do big moves that feel amazing and almost feel like you're breaking the game it's great. And I have learned from it as a designer, and it inspires me. And so that is why Tois is my #1 top game that inspired me that I played last year. And that is it, folks. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel. I hope to put out more content like this. And please share down in the comments, what games have you played recently that have inspired you specifically as a designer, that you find yourself marveling at the mechanics or just the beauty of the design. I'd love to read those, and I'm sure others would as well. So please share those down in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.